So I first went to Finland probably 13 years ago, and I noticed some things there that were kind of interesting. They reminded me a lot of the state of Maine. And the first was the topography. When you looked out the window, it was pretty likely that you were going to see trees, rocks, and water, and that was very familiar and very reminiscent. The other thing I noticed was that the climate was really very similar, at least to southern Maine's in the southern part of Finland. And if you look here, you can see that Helsinki is at a much more northerly latitude than Portland, but of course the Gulf Stream warms it and makes it much more temperate and a lot like here. Another interesting aspect, Finland for a long time has been among the most homogeneous and whitest countries in the world, and of course Maine has been one of the whitest states in the country, I think maybe second to North Dakota. But when I started going there, and over the several years since, there's a wonderful emerging diversity in Finland, just like there's a wonderful emerging diversity here in Maine. There was another thing I noticed that really seemed kind of frivolous at first, but turned out to have meaning. I noticed these big trucks. So they were maybe 18-wheelers like we see on the highway, or maybe 10-wheel dump trucks at construction sites. And they all had this big word across the front in these big, bold chrome letters. You know what the bulldog on a Mack truck looks like? Very muscular sort of figure. That's what these letters were like. And they spelled out the word sisu. And I said to my Finnish host, "That's an interesting word. What does it mean?" And he said, "Well, at the simplest, that's the name of the company that makes the trucks." But he said, "Actually, that term is at the very core of the Finnish psyche." Well, now I'm kind of interested, the core of the Finnish psyche. So I said, well, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean in English? And he says, nah, unfortunately, there's not really a word in English that describes it. It's like, oh, great, I really want to know what this is. And he said, well, maybe I can give you an example. He says, suppose you're hiking in the mountains, which we like to do, and you get to this promontory, and you're looking over this cliff at this beautiful landscape, and you get too close to the edge. And you step over the edge and you fall. The good news is there's a branch there that you can grab on the way down, so you grab the branch. He said the bad news is it's going to be an hour and a half before anybody comes by to help you. And I said, oh, so that's sisu, hanging on the branch for an hour and a half. And he said, no. He said sisu is hanging on the branch for 10 hours. Well, that's kind of interesting. And of course, the context for the Finns and sisu is very much the Winter War that was fought in Finland in 1939. It's a very interesting part of their history and their character. It's alleged that Hitler and Stalin got together in the build-up to World War II and decided how they were going to divide up the little countries in Europe that they planned to conquer. And Stalin was going to get Finland. And of course, Finland has always been squeezed between Sweden and Russia and always ruled by one or the other. So this is what we call in sports parlance a slam dunk. This is Russia against Finland. Russia had 3 times more troops, they had 30 times more airplanes, and they had 100 times more tanks. So the odds were Finland was going down, but Finland didn't go down because they were defending their homeland. So sisu has to do with perseverance and pluck and determination, and it struck me that's a lot like deciding that you're going to live in Maine, because it's not always easy. Well, I mean, come on. We all want to live here, but it can be pretty darn hard to build a career. So I thought, well, there's something else that's a lot like Maine, so that's kind of interesting. So we've got topography, we've got climate, we've got a matter of character. Is there anything else we ought to know about Finland that would be interesting to us here in Maine? Well, actually there is. The Finns have done a better job than any country in the world at educating their children. And that's really important to me because I'm passionate about education. I work at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, where one of our primary institutional goals is to cultivate a scientifically literate public. What do we mean by science literacy? We mean people who can think critically, people who can solve problems, people who collaborate well with each other, and people who can communicate effectively. How do we get to that? Well, in the case of the Cohen Center, which is our lab inside the lab for 5th and 6th graders, we bring over 10,000 5th and 6th graders from every county in Maine here for a half-day experience. It's a hands-on, inquiry-based science learning experience. It is our firm belief that kids best learn science by doing science. And what's particularly neat about this space is kids are getting at a question that we don't know the answer to. We're not lecturing them from a textbook to tell them what the collected wisdom is. And the question is, why are there so many lobsters in the Gulf of Maine? And while plenty of scientists have plenty of theories, nobody really knows. So it's really interesting to get kids at the center of this question because they explore things differently than we do. That's 5th and 6th graders. Once they get to the 7th and 8th grade, we really don't want to just let them wander off. So we offer a program in their home communities called Vital Signs. Vital Signs is a community of students, teachers, scientists, and citizen scientists who are united in attempting to determine the presence or absence of invasive species in those communities. We're able to leverage the laptop computers that every 7th and 8th grader has, and they're able to do rigorous science, and what they're doing is really important. Again, they're at the center of their learning. So that's how we think about education. Now, I was asked a very provocative question by one of my colleagues not too long ago. She said, Alan, everybody at work knows that I'm really into this Finland thing because I talk about it a lot. And she said, Alan, we really get the education piece because you keep sending us these articles. So we know really good at education. But what I'm curious about is, does this really great ability to educate kids, does this flutter through the rest of the culture? Does this show up, or is this just really an isolated silo? And I thought, man, that's a really interesting question. And as if to help me answer the question, Newsweek came up with a story not too much later, and the story was titled The 100 Best Countries in the World. So they established these 6 parameters: public education, healthcare, the quality of life, economic dynamism, or how vibrant is your economy, and the political environment. And look at this. Here's Finland. This is a country of just 5.3 million people, and they rank #1 in the world. So that's pretty interesting. So how'd the U.S. do? Well, we managed to make it to 11. And you'll note in the area, one of the areas that I'm really interested in, education, Finland is 1st, and the United States is 26th. So we're going to talk about that a lot, but first I want to jump to another metric, and that is one of the things I've learned from living in Maine is it's one thing to have great ideas. It's quite another to realize them. And what is required is a vibrant economy and a population that is really interested in experimenting with new ideas. So how vibrant is the Finnish economy? I mean, it's just a little teeny place. Is it really important? So I discovered the World Economic Forum. And every year they do something called the Global Competitiveness Report. And what they do is look at the economies of 142 countries in the world. And this is kind of interesting. From 2004 to 2010, you can see this little country of 5.3 million kind of holding its own against this country of 309 million. And interestingly, the 2011 numbers just came out on Thursday, and Finland ranked 4th and the US ranked 5th. So this stays really consistent in good economic climates and bad. I opened by maintaining that I noticed a lot of ways that Maine is like Finland, and here's some data. The Finnish population is 4 times the Maine population, so we have 4 times as many people living on 4 times the land area, and the Finnish gross national product is about 4.5 times Maine's gross domestic product. And I find interesting the population density, because a lot of times when people are talking about Maine, they're making the point that there's a lot of real estate and there aren't a lot of people. And look at this, Finland and Maine, for the sake of argument, are just about equal. And the reason I share these numbers is whenever we look at ideas, we're often asked, yeah, but how will it scale? And what's so interesting about this is we're talking about scaling downward. We can already see it working in Finland, and the question is, can we scale it down to our population of 1.3 million? So let's talk about education for a few minutes. We've got this pesky statistic. Finland's #1, the US is 26. I mean, who wants it to be like that? Why is it that we think Finland is #1 in educating its kids? The main reason is a series of tests. They're called the PISA tests, the Program for International Student Assessment. And this test is administered to 400,000 students every 3 years. They initially started, I think, in about 45 countries. They're now up to about 64. They started with 45 democracies. And here are the 2009 rankings, the latest rankings, 2009. And here's Finland at #1 in science, #1 in mathematics. By the way, these are the only 3 things they test. #2 in reading. They were pipped by South Korea by 1 point. So here's this little teeny country doing a fabulous job educating their kids. Well, obvious question is, so how do they do that? I mean, for instance, they must have a lot of homework, right? Because our kids do a lot of homework, and we're ranked 26. So if they're ranked #1, whoa, they must really pile it on. Well, no, actually they don't. 30 minutes of homework per night total for all subjects. So homework is not the answer. Well, let's think about some other things we do here. I bet they have a really long school year, because you know how we gnash our teeth every summer as summer comes up and we say, oh man, we got to have kids in school for more days, because over the summer they just forget everything they ever learned, and then we have to start over again in September. So probably Finland, they have a lot of school days. Fewer than 86% of the developed nations. So that's not the answer. So here we're talking about this place. I'm claiming they're the smartest kids in the world. Well, we know every child is not academically brilliant. So one would assume if they have this national goal, which they set 40 years ago, of producing the world's smartest kids, I mean, a lot of kids just must not measure up. They probably drop out, right? Because we know that's what happens in the United States. Well, actually, no, the dropout rate in Finland is 4%. 96% of their kids graduate from high school. The dropout rate in Maine is 13%, and in the United States it's 25%. So that's not exactly the answer. So the question is that this brings us to is, well, how do they keep these kids in school? I mean, think about how we keep kids in school. The really smart kids, we have classes for the gifted and talented, because we don't want them to be bored in school and not be challenged. We have honor societies, we have class rankings. You can be the valedictorian of your class, and that will help you get into a better college. And then for some other kids who maybe aren't so academically inclined, we have after-school activities. And a lot of people will tell you, for instance, when they're debating budgets, you know, we can't kill a football program because that's what keeps kids in school. Well, you think about Finland, they play awesome hockey. So they must do all that stuff. Like, they must have an awesome high school hockey program, right? Well, as it turns out, they don't do any of that stuff. There's no class ranking, there's no band, there's no sport. They just don't do it, because for them it's not part of the educational system. And I'll tell you where the theme of this conversation takes me. It seems like whatever we do a lot of, they don't do. So if you're talking with anybody about education in this country, you know what they'd first start talking about? Standardized testing. How many people here have kids in school? So you know about standardized tests. It's what we do. I mean, if the scores on the standardized test aren't good enough, we fire the principal, we move the teachers, and we give them a few $1,000,000 to straighten it out in a couple of years. And they must do a lot of that in Finland, right? Because they're cranking out the world's best kids. Guess what? There's a possibility of 2 standardized tests all the way through high school. The first is at the 6th grade level, but the teacher can opt in or opt out. So the teacher decides whether he or she wants his or her students tested. So that's not mandatory, that's optional. And then there's 1 test when you finish high school, because they'd kind of like to know how you did. So that's it, 1 standardized test in your school career. Pretty interesting. So we don't really have the answers as to exactly how they're doing this. Let's look at a few other metrics, because when we talk about education reform in Maine or anywhere else, we always get to money. And what we usually get to is pounding on teachers' unions. Hey, teachers, they won't budge, they're terrible. So in Finland, if you're going to crank out really smart kids, man, your teachers must really have to work hard. You know, every year, teachers sign a contract with their district, and that contract spells out how many hours the teachers are going to work. So let's look at the Finnish whoa, 570 hours they contract for in Finland compared to 1,255. That's the average teacher contract hour in Maine. Well, doesn't get too far into the conversation before you start talking about money. Now, Maine is a poor state. We all know that. We don't have a lot of money. And Finland, whew, it's one of those socialist countries. The tax rate, through the roof. They must have to pay teachers a fortune, wouldn't you assume? Oops, they pay teachers in Finland less than we pay teachers in Maine. How does that work? Well, there's one other metric we talk about a lot when we're talking about education, and that's cost per student. And one of the things that drives the cost per student in Maine is that we are a rural state. So transportation is a bigger cost than it is in certainly urban districts. But remember, Finland's kind of just like Maine in terms of how many people live in every square mile. So let's look at per pupil costs. Wow. So let's make sure we've all got this. Smarter kids for less money. What's wrong with this picture? So the question is, what do we have to do to get there? So let's look at some of the principles of Finnish education. Number one, if I could only talk about one thing. Number one, respect for the teaching profession. Here's how it works in Finland. 100% of Finnish teachers graduated from the top 10% of their class. It's not like that here. The competition to get into teaching school, for every 4 kids who apply who graduated in the top 10% of their class, only 1 gets in. Very competitive to be a teacher in Finland. Every single teacher in Finland has a 5-year teaching master's degree paid for by the state. Every single teacher, 5-year teaching master's. What that means is that the teachers are incredibly competent, and they are drawn into the whole process of, so what do we want to teach, and how do we want to teach it, because you're the experts. So they design for their classes, and the final feature, well, there's 2 final features. One, they have huge autonomy in their classrooms. This is not a top-down system, this is a bottom-up system, classroom by classroom. Thank you. And here's the real kicker. In Finland, teachers are more respected than doctors or business executives. Because education matters. All education is free to all, and we sort of all know that, right, about the socialist countries. But what's really interesting is if any of you get so inspired by this conversation to hop on an airplane and fly to Helsinki, it's free for you too. Finland came out of World War II as the poorest country in Europe, and they knew that the only way they were going to amount to anything as a country, and remember their economic competitiveness rankings, was to provide an educated populace. So if you go there tomorrow, you don't have to be a Finnish citizen or anything, you're just in Finland, you get to go to school for free. Pretty interesting. Number 3, and this doesn't look like the United States at all, they downplay educational competition. There is not competition student to student, there is not competition school to school, and there is not competition district to district. So tell me, every year when standardized tests are given in Maine, there's an article in the Maine Sunday Telegram, and it tells how tell me honestly, how many of you ever look at the rankings for your community to see how your school did? Yeah, it kind of pits one district to be, we live in Cumberland, so they're really doing a much better job with education. They just don't do that there. And prevent students from failing. It's been great preparing for this talk because there's been a real flurry of articles about why is the Finnish education system so successful. And one of them told the story of this middle school principal, and he had a 6th grader in his school, and the boy was the child of Kosovo-Albanian war refugees. So he had come to Finland under severe distress, and he wasn't doing well in school. So they brought a whole bunch of people in to talk with him and test him, and they determined that there weren't any learning disabilities or difficulties. He wasn't undermotivated, he wasn't lazy. He was just really struggling with the Finnish language, and any of you who've ever looked at the Finnish language, about the nicest thing I can say about it is that it is vowel rich. So no kidding. So this principal does something that they just don't do in Finland. He says, we're going to hold this boy back, and I am going to take him on as my mentee. I'm going to mentor him next year because I know that he actually really wants to read, and so I'm going to help him get there. Well, the way the story ends is that this 6th grader comes back to the school. Now he's 23 years old, and he's brought back a bottle of cognac for the teacher, for the principal, because he has started and is running 2 very successful companies in Finland. And what the principal says is in the end is, this is just what we do every day. We prepare kids for life. And then finally, self-reliance. This is a little flavor of our Sisu concept. Another article that I recently read, a principal was again talking about what they expect of students. And he said, for instance, we expect a 1st grader to walk to school through the woods in the snow and to lace up her own skates at recess. So just a delightful construct of what a first grader actually can do. So let's come back to Maine, because that's where we are. What does this mean for Maine? So here's some kids, and they're doing some science. Picture them, they're 11 years old. So picture them in 10 or 15 years, your own children, your grandchildren. They've applied for a job that they really, really want, and they've made it to the finalist pool. Just imagine the interview committee sitting around a table, and instead of saying, I think we should hire her because she has a degree in information technology, just imagine if they said, I think we should hire her because she's from Maine. That's my aspiration for education in Maine, and I hope you'll join me to help make it happen. Thank you.